Welcome to Human Enough, the podcast where we explore the stories, struggles, and conversations that reminds us what it really means to be human. I'm your host, Emmanuel. There comes a moment in many of our lives when the roles begin to change. The people who once held our hands need us to hold theirs. It's a season filled with love, but also uncertainty, exhaustion, heartbreak, and questions no one ever teaches us how to answer. Today's guest has lived through that journey and now helps others navigate it with wisdom, compassion, and hope. Joining us is Ingrid Hanson-Popp, author of Becoming an Orphan, the Caregiver's Guide to Lovingly Letting Our Parents Go, where she helps caregivers move beyond simply surviving and discover how to navigate one of life's most emotionally demanding seasons. Today we'll be talking about caregiving, grief, family, relationships, faith, resilience, and what it means to love someone well until the very end. Ingrid, welcome to Human Enough.
Thank you so much. That was a great intro. And I loved your comment about nobody teaches us how to answer these questions, and nobody teaches us how to navigate this time of our parents aging, etc. It's very true.
Uh, thank, thank you so much for that. Every caregiving story begins with love. Can you take us back to yours?
Yes. So, my family was very stable. It certainly wasn't perfect. I grew up in a Christian family and also on a dairy farm, which meant that except for when us kids were in school, away at school for the day, our family was together the whole time. We worked together, we played together. You're very close to the land, to the problems, like if there's no rain, dad is anxious about the crops and what are we going to do about it? And so all that just to say that I think the love started coming towards me, and my mom always had wanted to be a mom. And so all of us kids we always belonged. And like I said, part of that's the farming lifestyle. Everyone is important and everyone belongs and everyone has jobs to do, no matter how old or young you are. And so I think that's how it started for me, is a very stable. I belonged at home and I belonged there with my family. And I'm the youngest of three, and my oldest brother and sister were really good about including me, and my older sister, 16 years older than me, she's almost like a second mom to me. So,
All right. You wrote Becoming an Orphan after hearing so many caregiving stories. What surprised you most?
I think what surprised me the most was that the people who were telling me their stories, their frustrations ultimately, and their feeling overwhelmed, these were people who were smart, who were hardworking, who were problem solvers. And that's what got my attention was, wait, they're completely flummoxed. They're completely at wit's end of what to do. And these are bright, like I said, problem-solving people. And that's what caught my attention. And I think, I try to listen for divine messages. And I really felt like that was God saying, well, I think there's a need there, so why don't you do something about it?
Right. And why do so many caregivers feel alone?
Oh, well, I think some of the reasons have to do with when the caregiving our parents' season begins. Yeah, first of all, there are a whole lot of hmm, what do I want to say? Subtle emotions, emotional uh, pitfalls that occur. But I think what happens more often is that whoever whoever is kind of the point person, I've seen this in families, is that no matter how many siblings there are, there's usually one person that, because of their personality or their relationship to the parents or whatever, they kind of become the point person. And whether you're that point person or someone else supporting the point person in your family, there's this sneaky burden of thinking that you have to do this caregiving perfectly. And as you said in your introduction, nobody teaches us how to do this. And I think that one of the things that helped me get over that, uh, I would try things to help my mom or whatever, or even my in-laws, and it didn't work. And instead of wasting energy on feeling bad or that I'm not capable or I'm unintelligent or whatever, I would just flip it around to uh, what I do for a living full time, and that is I teach piano to people of all different levels. And I would turn it around for my own thinking and say, well, if I'm teaching so and so how to do such and such on the piano, and they've never done it before, would I criticize them if they didn't do it perfectly? Of course not. And so I think that that idea of, and we don't even realize we're doing it, that, well, I should know how to do this or I should do it perfectly, um, is is just not helpful. And I think the other reason we um, uh, uh, struggle is that we feel alone. We feel isolated, and sometimes isolated and alone can be simply the fact that there are many tasks to do just to care for that loved one, just whether it's medical, everyday things, hygiene things, never mind emotional and social things. And we feel like we have to, or we are doing this by ourselves, that we're alone. And that, I think, is one of the biggest problems, and that so much of my book addresses, starting with the cover. Here in the United States, in the Midwest, we have the geese who migrate in the fall. Once the weather starts turning cold, you know that winter is coming because the geese start flying south. And when they do that, they always do it in a flock. You'll never see a goose migrating alone because it isn't smart. What happens is that they fly in a team so that not one animal has to keep the brunt of the heaviest part of the burden in the front of they fly in a V, that they don't have to keep the brunt of the burden. When they get tired, they fall back, and another bird will come to the front and lead the rest of the flock. And so this thinking we have to do it alone, or we don't ask for help, or we can't figure out how to ask for help or where to ask for help, adds a lot of stress to caregivers that can be alleviated with a little bit of thought and a little bit of help.
Wow, thank you so much for that. Caring for aging parents often creates family conflicts. Why do you think that happens?
That is an excellent, excellent question. And I've thought about it a lot, actually. And it has to do with where we just were on the intensity of emotions that come up during this season. And the intensity of the emotions, have to do with, I think, two things: of of one, once a parent starts needing help or failing, depending on their age, everybody knows in the family system, everybody knows that the next step is the end of this earthly life. We don't, and some families talk about it, some families don't. And secondly, you mix that with the relationship we have with our parents is utterly and completely unique. And I mean that because meaning that I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't even exist except for my parents. And so there's that uniqueness of mixed with the thought of they're not going to be here forever. And so along with those intense emotions, one of the things I actually learned, I have a good friend who has spent her entire career as a mental health professional, and she contributed a chapter in the book specifically to mental health. And one of the things she wrote about that surprised me, she said, when, this may lead us to another part of our conversation, but she said when these emotions come up and these conflicts come up within a family, it's because we think we know our family, right? We think we know our siblings' personalities, or even our, if mom is the one that is failing, we think we know how dad's going to respond. And when it's something this serious and it's at the edge of the next step being death or being, passing on to the next life, we don't know how other people are really going to respond. And a lot of times their reactions are not what we expect. And we don't even realize we expect something else, whether it's reactions within ourselves of coming onto this pathway, or watching or observing the rest of the people in our family, that they react or act differently than we might expect them to. And so it creates, I think that's a lot of the foundation for a lot of the conflict. That was a long answer, but we've got a whole tangled kind of ball of yarn there of the intense emotions, unique relationship, and a sort of grief that even is starting, and people reacting differently to it.
All right. And then how can families communicate better?
I think the first step, well, maybe I'll just put it this way. I kind of have four ideas. And it has to do with bravery, dignity, real compassion by its definition, and making time for connecting. And I'll go backwards. So making time for connection, one of the regrets I have when I helped my mom was because of my personality as a planner. I want to make a list. I want to get it done. These are the things that mom needs help with. So I'm going to go down and visit her, and we're going to get these things done and check it off the list. But what I missed was the fact that she would have loved to just set some of the tasks aside and just visit and just make connection, hear about my life. That was the kind of person she was. And I wish I would have made more time to do that. Secondly, when I say real compassion, the definition of compassion is, we have a phrase, walk a mile in another person's shoes. In other words, if we could, let's say your parent has a medical health problem, and whether it's their mobility. Okay, so let's say they're having a problem with their hip, or they're facing hip surgery and they're not sure it's going to work, and just putting yourself in their situation in your mind and saying, okay, well, how would I feel about going into this surgery and realizing I may not be able to walk anymore? Or the one of your parents has some dementia or is losing their memory in some version of or another. Okay, so let's say if dad had Alzheimer's, I need to step into both his shoes of, because typically a person at the beginning of dementia, they're aware of it. They're aware that they can't find their words, and it would be putting myself into how scary would that be if I was all of a sudden I couldn't have conversations like this because I wouldn't be sure I would remember my words. How terrifying would that be? And I think that's the path to being patient with our parents as they lose, whether it's mental, physical, social abilities, and to think about what would that feel like for me if I lost that. And thirdly, one of the things that I felt really strongly about is my mom. She was pretty independent, and she liked it that way. And she also wasn't afraid to let people help her. But and I'll tell you a story about this, is helping preserve their dignity, I think, is crucial. So my mom needed to be admitted to the hospital, long story there, but they kept her in the hospital just long enough, but not moving around, that she couldn't walk anymore. She didn't have much margin. And so she was in a rehabilitative nursing home. This was her nightmare, that she would be in a nursing home. So I went to see her it was our holiday of Thanksgiving. Big deal. So I left my in-laws' home where we were having dinner to go see her. She'd been there for about 24 hours. And I walked into this dining room, and my mother was slumped over in a wheelchair, wearing someone else's clothes, in a dining room that was the music that was piped in was so loud, I could hardly hear myself think. And I thought, oh, no. And you have to understand, 2 weeks, 14 days before I found her like this in the nursing home, she'd been teaching Sunday school class at church to first grade girls. She was completely involved in her community 14 days earlier. I'm like, okay, this has got to stop. I don't know what they're doing. Are they giving her sleeping medication? What is happening? And I got mad, and I got very protective of her. And I think it's knowing when you need to be an advocate. And here, a lot of times it's in the medical system. So I immediately I'm like, okay, who's the doctor on call? I need to talk to the doctor. Oh, are we still there? And can you still hear me? Okay, there we go. And they said, no, we just have a nurse today. I found the nurse, and she said, well, how long has your mom been like this? And I said, absolutely never. And I said, if you're giving her any sleeping medication, you're stopping it right now, because she doesn't need sleep medication. Anyway, so that's just a little story of like, no, I need to be a fierce advocate for my mother, because she can't be that for herself, for her to retain her dignity. And then I mentioned bravery because it's hard to be honest. It's hard to have difficult conversations with a sibling or with your parent. And I think a very practical thing you can do is to face up to think about, okay, what do I really need to say to this person? But the simple tip is asking yourself, is now the right time to do that? So what happens a lot of times in families is everyone will have their own idea of what should happen for mom and dad. So you've got, 12 different ideas and everybody's arguing their point. That moment is probably not the moment to have a conversation with, let's say, your sibling who is, you know what, let's just listen to mom and dad. What do they want? And you may not do that right in the moment when everyone is all upset. You may just wait till the next day, have a Zoom call, say, hey, I think we need to talk about this when we're all a little bit more calm. Sometimes that can help. And and the bravery of saying what needs to be said, and that might be, it might be apologizing to your parent for something, who knows how long ago, or it may be asking them a question about a season in your life that you feel a little resentful about, to say, so can we just go back to such and so, and so what were you thinking, and did you have any idea how I felt during that, and can we talk about that? Because the time is shortening when you can even have those conversations at all. So, sorry, that was a really long answer, but
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I really enjoyed it. In your story, you made mention of when your mom was wanting to refuse help. I mean, that's one of the other situation anyone can be in. How do we navigate that? How do we navigate that?
when someone does not want help,
Yes.
yeah, that's hard. And I'll tell you why I'm saying it's hard, and I'm learning on this myself. This is my in-laws. So it's been about 2.5 years where my mother-in-law's had some pretty serious medical things going on. And she and my father-in-law still live independently in their own home, and they've hired, I think a lot of parents, they don't feel too bad if they can hire help. Like they've hired people to help clean the house, and they have a pretty big yard. It would be impossible for either one of them right now to like cut the lawn or take care of the yard or the snow in the winter. So they've hired help for that. But because of my expertise and experiences these last several years, I kind of think, well, I know what needs to be happening with them and the conversations we need to try to have with them. And the long and the short of it is I have had to recognize my in-laws, though they love me and we're quite close, they are not my mother. They have very differing personalities. Their faith in God is there, but it's very different and not as personal as my mother's faith was. And so I have had to that was the first light bulb that went on for me. When they didn't want help, I needed to just stand down and step back and stop pushing the issues that they didn't want to talk about, that they weren't going to let me in. And just say, well, when they need help enough, they'll be willing to ask my husband and me for help. And that was really hard. I just needed to stand down and wait. And I don't think it's the best for everyone, but that too is giving them their dignity and respecting what they want and what they don't want. Um, and on maybe a less severe or less serious side, I think one of the simplest statements you can make is when you have an idea to help your parents do whatever it is, to just present the idea calmly and with respect, and then say, how about we just try it once? Would you do that for me? Let's just try this once. And here's the story that's in my head when I'm explaining that. My mother, like I said, led a very active, independent life. She was widowed a second time, and she loved to drive her car. And she drove everywhere. It wasn't very far, but all the local places of her cardiac rehab and church and whatnot. So she lost her driving privileges. And one of the things, goes back to trying to create a team, not doing this alone. And I thought, well, how in the world am I going to find the time? How am I going to find 3+ hours a week to drive to her, take her to the grocery store, get her groceries, get them in her house, and then drive home? I'm like, that was just at the moment, that was just completely overwhelming and unrealistic. So there's a grocery delivery service at the time. This is pre-COVID. And I thought, okay. So I explained it to Mom. She didn't do computers at all. And so I was on the phone with her and I said, well, here's how it works. I'll log in and you tell me the things that you need for groceries, and I'll order them, and we'll figure out when's a good time for the truck to deliver your groceries. I'll pay with my credit card and you can just reimburse me. And she was very, very, very hesitant. And I must have said, well, let's just try it. And the beauty of this success story is it was probably about a week later, Mom called me. And that, first of all, that's unusual. Usually I called her. Mom called me and she said, so when are we going to do groceries again? And she was so excited about it. And so that, like I said, sometimes it's just saying, let's just try it.
Wow, thank you so much for that. You know, you often speak about faith and spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
How do they shape the caregiving journey?
Oh, wow. Yes. Well, as I've intimated, my family, my mother had no fear of death. She had trusted in Christ as her savior, and heaven was just as real to her as this earth, and more so as she got closer to the end. And so the fact that she and I shared that faith, as I said, it really made our journey together easier. I remember several years before she died, she had major heart surgery, and I was in the hospital with her when they were going to, take her away for the surgery. And I don't remember if I prayed with her or not, but I just said, I'm going to cry. I said, Mom, I'll see you when you wake up. And if I don't, I'll see you in heaven. So the security that gives is huge. And I think just being a caregiver, I remember the moment, wow, there's so much letting go and trusting God. But I remember, as I mentioned, that the day I drove home and Mom had lost her driving privileges because of a disease in her eyes. And I was with her at that appointment. And I dropped her back at home, and I was in my hometown and running some errands. And I just remember thinking, oh boy, we're on the path now. I didn't even know what it was called, right? But I'm like, wow, stuff's going to change in a big fat hurry right now for my life as well as Mom's. And I just remember God speaking to me and saying it, and you get to be part of it. And I think that was because the moment in this eye doctor appointment was such an intense moment for her. It was a huge loss. She was tearful. The doctor let us have some time together, just her and I, to absorb the information. And that's what God was speaking was, this is going to be a privilege for you to be in this role. And it was just God's grace. But I think the letting go, I use that phrase of, well, and that's in the title of the book, letting go. And when it comes to a caregiver's own faith, it's the letting go of, wow, of pride, sometimes of planning, of knowing what to expect, and just trusting that God's going to help you along the way, because you don't know what's coming down the road next. And to trust and to let go of your own expectations, I think, because you just have to see it unfold. And that, for a personality like mine that's can be rather driven sometimes, or is such a planner, letting go of what I think should happen, holding it loosely. I guess holding what you plan and how you help, holding that loosely. Because it could be there's somebody else in the family that can do X, Y, or Z better than you can, or there's, for some reason, you cannot be available for a particular season or an event or an appointment or something. And you have to let others in to help. So yeah, holding those plans and expectations of your own self, how you're doing caregiving, how it's going to look, how it's going to turn out. You have to hold those loosely with knowing that God's got you and God's got your parents. He can handle all of it.
All right, thank you so much for that. One chapter people really talk about is what happens after our parents die.
Mm.
What was that? What was that season like?
It can be pretty unpredictable. And because when my mom passed, she was my second parent. I lost my dad when I was 15 years old, and then mom lived to be 87. And you really do feel like you're lost at sea. And it's very hard to pinpoint. It's almost, it's very hard to pinpoint. But the fact that supportive person, and in my life, both parents were supportive, very much in their own way, and that they're not there anymore. It's, and I think one of the things that helped me feeling that kind of lostness, helped me through that, was just letting myself have the time to cry or to grieve or to be still or to remember. Or and my husband was great about making sure that I wasn't super, super busy. But just feeling the things as they come along. And I think the strange thing about grief is that you never know when it's gonna, their loss or that parent's absence, when it's gonna hit you. And to take the time and set aside time to just cry or just to remember, or to go to the cemetery and see your parents' grave markers. What maybe it's on the anniversary of their death or their birthday or something, and it's something you can physically, tangibly do. And whether you pray when you're there or you talk to them, I think can be helpful. And I have to say this. So my friend Valerie, who wrote the chapter on mental health for the book, she was working overseas as a missionary therapist, actually, and she almost never telephoned me because of the time zone difference and whatever. And so I was sitting at home quietly, and she called, and the first thing I said is, "Everything okay?" And she said, "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm calling to see how you are." And she said, "How are you doing being an orphan?" And it took me a few seconds to realize what she meant. And then an orphan doesn't have parents anymore. And that's where I knew what the title of the book would be from that conversation, which was, a year or two before.
Right. Becoming an orphan is not only about losing parents, it's also about discovering who we become afterwards.
Mm.
So what do you hope readers, take away from the book?
Absolutely. That's a great way to phrase it. Because the concluding chapter has to do with legacy and thinking about, as you think about your parent, what did I inherit from them? And sometimes it's very obvious, like a physical feature. I have the same nose, or I have the same tone of voice, or I have the same kind of walk, or the same kind of whatever. But as you think about your parents, you can see both the positive and the negative parts of their legacy that you inherited. And I think looking at those, the legacies that they left you, it almost feels disrespectful or unkind, but very often once they're gone, it's almost easier to recognize the negative things, and decide, you know what, I don't need to keep that. I don't need to be like that. I can change that. Or to embrace and remember what I'm learning about myself right now in this journey as an author and a speaker and talking on podcasts, is that my mom, she didn't have a lot of opportunities, but she wasn't afraid of public speaking, which is pretty rare. And I think to myself sometimes, she would love to hear what I'm doing right now. And she'd probably love to do the kinds of things I'm doing right now, because I inherited that love of words and for whatever reason, a confidence, which kind of was linked up with my dad, growing in self-confidence as well as in our faith, to just speak our minds. And we weren't afraid what other people were going to say, or if they would agree or disagree. So yeah, it's taking those legacies, embracing them, and kind of smiling as you remember your parent for the positive things, and the negative things, sometimes you learn about them too, of, well, why did he work so hard? Or why was he not affectionate? Wasn't that he didn't love us, but why was he not affectionate? And then I remember how his dad taught him to parent. I'm like, oh, well, that explains that. So, Yeah, you can take the positive and the negative legacies and decide, you know what, I don't want to be like that. I don't have to be that way.
Right. And then what did healing look like for you?
That season of once they were gone.
Yes.
Hmm. Here's a again, it almost sounds sacrilegious to say, but after mom was gone for a while, I remember every time there was a severe storm, whether it was a thunderstorm or ice storm or snow, and she, lived in the old farmhouse, and there were lots of very, very, very big trees close to the house. And I remember waking up one night in a thunderstorm here at home and thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to check in on mom. I got to see if she's okay. And then I thought, no, you don't. She's fine. She's with Jesus, and you don't have to do anything. And it was this relief of, I don't have to make sure that her, the weather's affecting her ill, or she can't get out, or she's whatever. It was kind of a relief to not have to be always in my mind alongside my life. I didn't have to be thinking, okay, how is this affecting, what's this weather doing for mom, or how's she doing? Is she doing all right? Are all the things at church working the way they need to be working? And is she still going to cardiac rehab? And I didn't have to, I had a whole agenda of things that weren't on my plate anymore. And truthfully, it was a relief. And I think that's okay.
Wow, thank you so much. And then still talking about healing, do you think is healing all about making those grief disappear?
Mm. Okay, again, I've got to mention the mental health chapter. Uh, Not necessarily. I think we what's the word I want? We stop the progression of growing if we think that we should stop grieving, or we shouldn't feel sad, or that it's bad, or whatever. I think we lose out on a lot of growth, and the grief, I think if it's healthy. So my friend Valerie, she mentioned, if after like 4 months, I think was her kind of guideline, if you're still devastated and you still can't really function, which is pretty normal, like the first week after you have a big loss like that, that's pretty normal. And you shouldn't be making big decisions and whatnot, whatever. And, but if you're still in that state and it's not getting better after, say, 4 months, that the grief is just, it's a roadblock to your own life and your own progress of living, whatever that is, then you want to go see a professional. But other than that, and she also talks about complicated grief. That can happen when one of your parents was not a good parent, when that parent was abusive, when the relationship was just toxic. That could show up as complicated grief, where you just can't seem to move on. And again, she suggested talking to a professional counselor about that. And so the grief, I think when it's normal, healthy grief, it's more intense. At the beginning, you think about that person a lot. things will make you cry easily. I think that you should cry, that it's important. And then being okay with it can be being okay with living supersedes dying, and it should. So my life and whatever I'm doing, again, is kind of center stage, and it should be, and that's okay if I'm not remembering that loved one for a few days, and then something prompts me to remember them. And I think that's very normal. And I remember one of the shared. I'll just share this as an example. So my dad died when I was 15, and the moments that I would miss him the most were typically big life events: graduating from high school, getting my driver's license, graduating from college, getting my master's degree. And I remember that particular the ceremony, and afterwards, my mom and her second husband and I were had gone to my master's graduation. And by this point, 10, 15 years later, after Dad had died, Mom and I didn't even have to say words, because what we were both feeling was, I wish Dad could have been here. And that's just part of it. And I was relieved and glad that Mom and I could share that moment, her as a spouse and me as a daughter, I wish Dad would have been at these important events. I've said to my husband, I wish you and my dad could have gotten acquainted. They never met. And it just is. It's kind of melancholy, but it just is.
All right. And then looking back, what do you wish every caregiver knew before before the journey begins?
That's a great question. I think two things, and we've touched on them briefly through our conversation, that you really are never alone. And I mean that from a spiritual standpoint and from a practical standpoint. Even if you're an only child, you're not alone. There will be other people. There are ways to, and I talk about this in the book and the website and whatnot, of reaching out to others. And I think the cool thing is that, generally speaking, people want to help. Other people want to help, but they don't know how to help. Little short story. My husband and I were vacationing. I don't know, we were about 4 or 5 hours away. And my mom called and said, "Oh, I forgot I had this doctor's appointment," which of course she could not drive to. And I said, "Oh, well, Mom, I'm not at home." I said, "Hang on a second. Let me make some phone calls." And I called my cousin-in-law, who I knew she wasn't working at the time. She lived in the next town. She was part of our regular, family. We'd see them normally, close, in other words. And I said, "Debbie, would you mind? Mom forgot this appointment. Do you think you'd be able to pick her up and take her to this appointment?" And she's like, "Sure, not a problem." And off she went. But I had to think a little bit outside of, okay, who else could I ask for help? In other words, that you're not alone. And then just from a spiritual standpoint, whether someone prays regularly, has a connection with God regularly, or in a strong way, almost everyone I interviewed for the book, about 25 different people, And some of them were not necessarily Christian, but they were very aware of the spiritual dimension when this season came. And they stayed open to that. And I think there's just the Jesus help me prayer, and that God is ready to answer that sort of prayer, that you aren't alone. And that's the practical standpoint and the spiritual standpoint.
All right, thank you so much for that. And then for listeners who would like to learn more about your work and becoming an orphan, where can they connect with you?
Great. So God has wired me to be an encourager. And my passion behind writing the book, as well as other resources, is I want to give caregivers practical help and hope. And so you can find the book wherever you buy books. My favorite is Barnes and Noble, but yeah, Becoming an Orphan, A Caregiver's Guide to Lovingly Letting Our Parents Go. The book is going to be a huge help. And the website, my team and I have so many different types of resources and encouragements on the website. So any caregiver can just go to becominganorphan.com and check out the website. I think you'll find it helpful.
All right, thank you so much for that. And then one final question I would like to ask is, if someone listening and is currently caring for an aging parent, maybe they are exhausted, overwhelmed, or feeling guilty, what would you want them to hear today?
I would like them to hear two things: the guiltiness or feeling like you're not doing it right, to just set that sense of guiltiness, set it aside. It's only a negative, it's only negative thoughts that are going to drag you down, which is not what you need. It's not what your parent needs. And overwhelmed, I would say, just find one simple thing that you find joyful, restorative. It can be stepping away from all the caregiving stuff and listening to your favorite song. It can be stepping away from all the caregiving stuff and whatever it is you love doing, taking a walk outside, watching the movie you want to watch. That when that overwhelm it's real, it's not because you're weak, but you need to tend to yourself. Because if we don't tend to ourselves as caregivers, eventually our bodies rebel and we won't be any good for helping our parents if we don't take care of ourselves. So when you feel that overwhelm, it might take you a minute. It may take you a little bit of thought of what could I do to support myself to do something I love, even if it has to be in a different format or shorter or whatever. Find something that you find restorative to you, and take action and do it.
All right, thank you so much for that. And then that brings us to the end of today's episode on Human Enough. Ingrid, thank you for reminding us that caregiving is not simply about helping someone through the end of life. It's about loving deeply, showing up faithfully, and discovering strength we never knew we possessed. Thank you so much for being a wonderful guest on the show today.